nation's capital, the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research presents Public Policy Forums, a series of programs featuring the nation's top authorities presenting their differing views on the vital issues which confront us. Today's topic, choosing presidential candidates. How good is the new way?
Back in what some people like to refer to as the good old days, presidential candidates were sometimes chosen in so-called smoke-filled rooms. Often, it was a select few, labor leaders, elected officials, party functionaries, and favorite sons from key states. These were the ones who had a major voice in selecting the candidates, who then sought to become president of all the people. Many thought that was undemocratic. On the other side, there are those who now argue that experience in politics is vital, and that it is wrong to think political professionals cannot be honest or care about good government. They think that the trend away from strong political parties and toward more state primaries has been a serious mistake. In any case, a number of changes were instituted in the Democratic Party beginning in 1969. Proportional representation for allocation of convention delegates. Party leaders and elected officials no longer are automatic delegates. And an affirmative action plan seeks now the participation of women, blacks, and other minority delegates. Some now say that the process has gotten out of hand, that it's too cumbersome, that the media have too much influence, that the system elects candidates who look good on TV but cannot govern. Who is right? Should we make further changes, for instance, a national primary? Or should we try to strengthen the political parties and restore their role in candidate selection? Welcome to another Public Policy Forum presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research and education organization. Today's roundtable discussion will consider the question, how good is the new way of choosing presidential candidates? Appearing on our panel are Richard Scammon, Director of the Elections Research Center in Washington. He is an election consultant with NBC News, a visiting fellow of AEI, and a member of the editorial board of the AEI magazine called Public Opinion. Mr. Scammon, a former director of the Census Bureau, is an expert on the election process. David Broder is a columnist and political reporter for the Washington Post. He won a Pulitzer Prize in 1973 for distinguished commentary. Mr. Broder has been a political writer for the Congressional Quarterly, the Washington Star, and the New York Times. He has covered every national and major state political campaign and convention since 1956. Austin Ranney is a resident scholar at AEI. Prior to joining AEI in 1976, Dr. Ranney spent 13 years as professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin. He has served as president of the American Political Science Association and has written many works on political subjects, including detailed studies and analyses of the reforms instituted by the Democratic Party in the 60s and 70s. Ken Bode is a political correspondent for NBC News. He is a former political science professor at Michigan State University and the State University of New York at Binghamton. He has served as politics editor of the New Republic magazine. Dr. Bode played a personal role in developing the Democratic Party reforms of the 60s and 70s as a member of 3 commissions which recommended party changes. John Daly is the panel moderator. Mr. Daly is a former director of the Voice of America. He has served as a news correspondent and analyst for CBS News and for ABC News, and as a vice president of the ABC network. Now, here is Mr. Daly.
This Public Policy Forum, part of a series presented by the American Enterprise Institute, is concerned with the process by which we nominate presidential candidates and its impact on the office of the presidency, the general political system, and ultimately on the United States Constitution. Before reform and the new way of presidential nominations, which may roughly be dated from the McGovern Commission reforms adopted within the Democratic Party in 1969, the old way involved a mixture of state party caucuses and state primaries. The major role and power, however, was vested in state party leaders and elected officials in the national nominating conventions. They could ignore primary results, and if they would, and they could also do it if they didn't particularly have an interest in a candidate, and they did. In 1952, Estes Kefauver swept all the primaries but one, but the Democratic Convention leadership preferred Adlai Stevenson. Stevenson won. It was also possible to confound the convention leadership. Astute pressure on delegates and wildly enthusiastic packed galleries stampeded a convention to produce a surprise candidate, Wendell Willkie, in the 1940 Republican Convention. The New Way, on the other hand, championing open access to the presidential nominating process by all interested party members, mandated involvement of women, young people, and minority groups, allocated convention delegates among presidential candidates according to proportional representation, no more winner take all, and ruled out the old practice of reserved delegate seats for party leaders. This, said the reformers, would assure the delegates at the National Party Convention would fairly reflect voters' preferences. Well, the New Way has produced significant changes. For instance, a startling rise in state primaries. In 1968, roughly 40% of the delegates to the national conventions were chosen in 17 primaries. In 1976, 75% of the delegates were chosen in 30 state primaries. The figure for 1980, 35 state primaries select 80% of the delegates. The New Way, however, has not quieted the call for reform. There are those who urge selection of national convention delegates by regional primaries. Others urge a direct national primary, replacing conventions altogether. That is the granddaddy of all reform proposals, first introduced in the Congress in 1911. In fact, of 250 bills introduced since 1911 dealing with reform of presidential nominations, about half have been some version of the direct national primary. So our subject, choosing presidential candidates, how good is the New Way? Mr. Bode, as research director of the original McGovern-Reform Commission in 1969, are you satisfied with the results?
By and large, I am, yes. I think that the reforms were essentially a moderate and careful response to a series of abuses that were uncovered in 1968, things that have been going on for a long time. I think basically they've gotten a bad rap. There's been a certain amount of historical revisionism about what the reforms have produced, some of which you just stated a moment ago, to wit that they created a bunch of primaries. The current rash of primaries that we have now are caused by those reforms. I think, in effect, they were written by party leaders carefully, thoughtfully, and they headed off more radical responses like a direct election of the president, eradication of the Electoral College, and the national primary legislation that's been kicking around Congress ever since 1968. They've also survived two very serious re-examinations by reform commissions of the Democratic Party that were not disposed to take those reforms as gospel when they met. The Mikulski Commission, the Winograd Commission after the 72 and 76 elections. And I think that is a testament to the fact that the core of these reforms are with us to stay.
All right, Mr. Broder, in your book, The Party's Over, you argue that the traditional party role in the United States is diminishing because of the New Way nominating process. Briefly, how and why?
In the old way, I think, John, essentially if you wanted to run for President of the United States, what you did was to take a couple months off from whatever public office you held in the year of the presidential election, and you presented your credentials to the leaders of your own party, other elected officials, party officials, leaders of allied interest groups, bosses in some cases. They were people who had known you over a period of time and examined your work fairly carefully and at close range. In the new way of running for president, the first thing you do is get out of public office, so you have nothing to do for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, or in some cases now 6 years, but run for President of the United States, and you take your case not to the professionals who know you, not to your political peers, But to the amateurs who meet you only briefly in their living room or in the town hall and have very little basis on which to make that screening, I think the new way has served to diminish the kind of careful screening that the Office of the Presidency requires.
All right, Mr. Scammon, as director of the Elections Research Center, are the substantial reforms of the new way enough reform, or would you consider regional or direct national primaries?
I don't really think it makes that much difference. As long as a large percentage of the electorate, whether it's the total electorate or not, can vote at least a preference for president, even if they don't elect delegates. As long as this fact is available to the leadership and they know what they're doing. The case you cited in 52 was well taken. The fact is that Kefauver was liquidated by the leadership, by the bosses, whatever word you want to apply, and replaced by a man who never run on anything. Not that either one of them would have done much good in November against General Eisenhower, but it seems to me that the basic need is for a continuing participation of the mass, at least in the expressing of an opinion. As between the 2 or 3% who participate in the caucus and the 20 or 30% who participate in the primary, it may be I'm a primitive Democrat with a small p and a small d, but it just seems to me that the great leavening in American politics is that alone amongst most of the democracy of the world, our people have something to say en masse about who the nominees are going to be, rather than just voting on what some leadership group has given them in the fall.
All right, Dr. Ranney, has, in your view, the new way given all of the party membership full participation in the candidate selection process and all of us the promise of the best candidate possible?
Well, if by the party membership, Mr. Daly, you mean those people who are legally eligible to ask for the ballot of a particular party in a primary, there's no question, yes, they all have a full and complete chance to participate, as Dick Scammon says. As to the quality of the candidates, I would say let's simply look at the facts. Since the reforms first went into effect, we've had 4 presidential candidates. One was the first president in history to be forced to resign his office. One received the lowest vote a presidential candidate has ever gotten for a major party. The third was the first president in office since Herbert Hoover to be denied re-election. And the fourth one now has the lowest showing in the polls of any incumbent president since the polls have been taken. Those are the facts. I suggest you draw your own conclusion.
Dr. Ranney, wasn't Richard Nixon nominated by the Republicans in 1960 and by the Republicans in 1968?
He was the first gentleman.
I mean, the reforms don't really have to bear the burden of Richard Nixon. In fact, it seems to me the old system, if you have to choose between a Carter, who's a weak president, and a Nixon, who was a venal president, I'll take Carter.
All right, well, we'll see whether the American people agree with you on that.
Mr. Scammon?
I think one must also remember, in our exercise in nostalgia for the good old days, that the old system gave us the paragon of virtue, Warren G. Harding, our well-known great president of the 20s. And I doubt very much, really, whether systems alone are going to give you good or bad presidents. I think a lot of other things, social and economic conditions, the nature of the government entirely, will have a good deal more to do than one system or the other. Either can produce good, either can produce bad. Probably both will do that.
Well, the only dissent I would offer on Dick Scammon's point is that I think we know that this system that we're trying to operate now does in fact eliminate people who are not prepared to take a substantial period out of their public life, sacrifice a good deal of their private life, family life, and so on, and spend those 2 years, 3 years, or 4 years going from town to town, introducing themselves to strangers, and attempting to break through that barrier of what is, I think, fair disinterest on the part of the public, and to strike some kind of ephemeral spark in those voters' mind that may cause that tiny minority of them who really deliver the nomination in this system to do something what is unnatural, namely to go out of their house on a cold night in January in Iowa or on a cold day in February in New Hampshire in order to help somebody become president the following November.
don't we generalize a little bit too strongly from some rather small number of cases? Namely, I think Jimmy Carter, he's the one who really started the business of taking time off from your business and going and campaigning for a couple of years. If Ted Kennedy or Howard Baker are the nominees of the two parties this coming election, both reasonable possibilities, then everything you said about not being willing to take 2 or 3 years out of public life simply won't obtain.
Dr. Ranney?
I would like to make a general point. Ken Bode and I here, who do not share some things, do share the fact that we were both heavily associated, I as a member, he as research director, with the original McGovern Commission. And I would say whatever blame is attaching to that commission's effects, we have our share of, and whatever praise is due to it, we also have a share of. But I think it's already clear in the comments that we have made here, a part of a general phenomenon, and that is the different way that people go about appraising these reforms, as I have observed it in conversations and panels like this and books and articles. And I see two quite different ways of looking at things, and I think I've seen it here. One group I would describe as the virtue is its own reward school. The notion that the reforms are to be appraised according to their intrinsic fairness. They are more democratic, they are more open, more people participate. They are simply better and fairer. And then there is another school that I think might be encapsulated by another well-old aphorism, by their fruits ye shall know them. Which asks what kind of impact do they have upon the state of the political parties? What kind of candidates do they characteristically produce? What do they do about the quality of the general popular attitude toward the nature of our political system and toward our presidential selection system? And I think that Mr. Broder and I are clearly of the by their fruits ye shall know them. I rather suspect that Ken is a virtue is its own reward, and I hope there will be at least some meeting of the minds of these two schools here this evening.
All right, Mr. Broder, what do you see as the principal wrongs of the reforms since 1969?
I think the basic intellectual error that was made by the reformers, and it's one I acknowledge that I did not understand until some of the consequences began to roll in, was that their complaint, and we're talking here basically about the Democrats, their complaint was the 1968 Democratic Convention was not representative of the real will of the party. When they began to rewrite the procedures, they made the significant transference from wanting to improve the system of representation to wishing to open the opportunities for participation. Representation, participation. Representation is a complex and subtle political process. We can be represented in many ways. There is only one way that you can participate, and that is by being there yourself. By making that fundamental intellectual error, I think the Commission set the stage for creating what is, in effect, a highly elitist presidential selection system, in which those who have the knowledge, the leisure, and the financial resources to be present themselves have a disproportionate and inordinate impact on the selection process, and particularly in the Democratic Party. Again, the representative nature of the Democratic Convention, in fact, I think has declined since the period of the reforms.
Mr. Scammon, do you feel that all the reforms growing out of the efforts begun by the McGovern Commission are good? Would you change any of the current practices?
Let me, if I may, comment on one question that leads up to that. I would not really say that the present movement, which we still see going on for more primaries, came out of '69 and those two commissions. It came out of Jack Kennedy in 1960 proving a Roman Catholic could be elected President of the United States. And the only way he could prove it was to go into West Virginia, go into the other states where there was a problem, and prove to the local party leadership, whose enlightened appreciation of the public will, David, might not have produced this view otherwise, that he could whip Hubert Humphrey. Now, when he did that, he then opened up not so much the detailed reforms that you speak of, John, or that Ken spoke of. He just opened up the idea that people were saying, well, hell, I want to have a part of this too. If it can work in 60, it can work in 64, and it can work in 68. So it produces perhaps a Barry Goldwater one time, a McGovern the other time, both of whom, at least as far as the November judgment is concerned, are less than ideal candidates, but that isn't the point. The point is that, again, from the viewpoint of a primitive Democrat, 30% is better than 3%. And if you've got 30% voting in a nominating primary, and as a matter of fact, in the 76 primary, of the total presidential vote cast in the states that had primaries, half of them went into the primary. And this is so much more an exercise of popular will. Forget whether it's good or bad, an exercise of popular will than you see anywhere else in the world that I remain impressed by.
Mr. Broder?
Dick Scammon's example is the critical one. It is a fact, as he says, that John Kennedy could not have been nominated if there had not been a West Virginia primary which he could demonstrate that Protestants would vote for a Catholic. But Kennedy ran in 4 contested primaries, 1960, 4 of them. Contrast with the 35 that await anybody who wants to be in the nomination in 1980. After he had won West Virginia, he still faced a requirement to persuade the leaders of his party, the governors, the mayors, the leaders of the allied interest groups, particularly organized labor, that he had the qualities that they were prepared to stake their reputation on as being the best man to be the standard bearer for the party. Contrast that with Jimmy Carter, who never had to meet, and in fact, in many cases, did not meet those similar officials until after he had achieved the Democratic nomination. The significance of the difference for the presidency is that in one case, a man, if he is elected, comes with the alliances that make him a reasonable prospect to put together the kind of coalitions and support that make it possible for him to lead a government. In this kind of a nominating system, he comes as a fellow whose only coalition is whatever he got out of the living rooms in Iowa. And if there is one thing that Jimmy Carter's frustration in office ought to teach us, it is that the affiliation and the commitment that is made on Iowa caucus night and New Hampshire primary day is not by itself sufficient to sustain a man for 4 years in the White House.
Dr. Ranney?
I would like to hear Dick Scammon and some others comment on what is the next big proposal to reform, and logically, doesn't your position lead you to support a one-day national primary, a complete abolition of the National Convention?
It would if you gave to the states no role to play in this and said, as is so often said in this country, there ought to be a law. And therefore, by God, you're going to vote come what may. The next step, I suppose, is compulsory voting. But I would like to see all the states adopt their own primaries, but this is up to them. And I would rather maintain the states' power to make judgments in this than to see a national primary law.
I think we really overestimate the influence that the addition of a few presidential primaries have had on the state of our parties in this country. We're in a period of great sweeping reform, which began probably back with the reapportionment decisions in the mid-'60s, early 60s, the Voting Rights Act, the 18-year-old vote, public financing of elections, all combined with the growth of television, the influence of television on our parties, the movement of candidates away from political parties as a organizing mechanism for garnering support, for turning the movement of parties away from party organizations to turn out the vote. All these things are very important in terms of the way things have influenced our parties. And it seems to me that if we want to say that primaries are party weakening devices, which I think is what we're saying here, and I think that's a fairly strong body of opinion amongst political scientists these days, then we've got to look to the base of the parties where we've had primaries, thousands and thousands of primaries at the state and local level ever since the progressives came in around 1912 or 1910, 12, and so forth. That's where the parties need to be revitalized, and if we really want to talk about primaries as weakening devices, then we should face up to the fact that maybe we ought to get rid of the primaries at the local levels. Is that an option?
Well, let me pose the question. What have the reforms done to the viability of state parties and state leadership, which under the old way was really quite large?
I think, once again, it's been vastly overstated. The National Democratic Convention, Republican Convention meets for 4 days once every 4 years. What the reforms have done is said simply that delegate status to a nominating convention, the place you nominate presidents, simply can no longer be considered a legitimate patronage function of the party. That the people The rank and file voters have to have some say in it, and you simply can't pass it out to the party jobbers and envelope lickers and fat cats. I think very little else. I think the weakening of the parties is really due very substantially to other factors.
Dr. Ranney?
Yes, I think we may have here a good case of the contrast between the virtue is its own reward and by their fruits ye shall know them. I understand from Ken that the system is much more open, much more fair, much democratic. All of those evils have been done away with. The parties in the process are a lot purer than they are today. Well, Ken, Dave Broder and his brethren in the print press, and you and Dick and your colleagues in the electronic press have evidently not gotten the message to the American people. Let me, if I may, Mr. Daly, read a few figures. The last unreformed, evil, old-fashioned election was 1968. Voting turnout, 61%, 1972, 55%, 1976, 54%. Or turnout in contested presidential primaries, in a study that I personally have perpetrated. Between 1946 and 1968, the average turnout in primaries where both parties had a contest was 39%. And in 1972 and in 1976, it was 28%. Okay? A third one, in various Gallup and Harris polls that were taken in 1968 before, people were asked the question, do you think it makes a great deal of difference who wins the election? And prior to 1968, about 65% said yes. Now 33% said less. People were asked, do you agree with the statement that ordinary people don't really have any say in what goes on in our government now? In the old unreformed days, only 40% agreed with that. Now 75% would do it. So you can see what cleaning up the system and reform has done for popular confidence in the process, and a few more reforms, and I would say that a real cataclysm could occur. Now, I know the reforms weren't responsible for any of this, Ken, but they haven't been responsible for any good things that I can see either.
Well,
Mr. Scammon?
I think, though, what we really need, and it's the same story on the same basis, Austin, if I use your line of reasoning, all of the changes that have liberalized voter registration since '60 ought to be repealed because they haven't increased the voter turnout.
No, but they ought not to be praised for having greatly improved the system.
No. Just voter turnout is not the only criterion by which you judge the system. The system is judged by the access that the average citizen has to it. Now, he may very well decide, perhaps in wisdom, that voting is a sort of a stupid thing, that there are a lot more interesting things around the world. Gardening, sex,
Please.
bowling. Are you pulling your
Both ears. Pulling them right off.
And
I can see the case for bowling, Dick, but hold on.
But I think in the modern world, as we get a more and more literate population, people may really decide, as they have long ago decided in many city elections, that participation is not really the end and be all. Now, journalists will find this difficult because it hits their business. Academics, the same way. Intellectuals, the same way. But you know, somebody put it to me this way. In the city of Boston, the schools are run by Judge Garrity. Why should I vote for the Boston School Committee? In other words, when you take power away from people, they also react to it. I would think that the presidential primary system that we have now, and I'm not speaking of all of the extra reforms, Ken, that were put in about equal representation, just the primary itself, giving people a chance to their little moment, their little 10, 15 seconds in the polling place where they can say something, is tremendously important, as it is for the nominating procedures in virtually every state in the Union. I would like to see it at least maintained and possibly expanded.
Richard, your argument was so wonderful right up to the conclusion, but then you slid off of what I thought logic would take you. If it is true, as I think it clearly is, that politics is a relatively low-ranking interest of most sane people on a year-in, year-out basis, then why not premise your presidential selection system on that fact and focus the public interest at the point in the cycle which is natural, namely when the field has been narrowed to 2 candidates and we have a couple of months to examine those candidates under some tests of adversary kind of debates and endurance, and let the people make that judgment. I think through our history we have the basis for saying with great confidence that the wisdom is in the people under those circumstances. But what we have done now in this new presidential primary dominated selection system is to ask the people to be involved over a much longer period of time. And not just the people, but the candidates as well. Because I want to mention, John, just quickly, two other consequences of this new system, which I think have to be weighed in the balance. One is the character of the people who run for office. They are those who are so ready to yield to their ambition above all other things that they are prepared to make this kind of long-term sacrifice of time and effort. Second, the consequence is that to sustain themselves in that long effort, they have to find help from other people who are prepared to make a similar sacrifice in their own lives. Characteristically, these are young people who are ready to take the gamble because they have very few other attractive alternatives as appealing as the chance to somehow leap ahead and find themselves in the White House. The predictable consequence of this kind of a nominating system is that you find in the White House, close to the president, making key decisions about government, young people whose essential skills are in the tactics and the logistics of a long presidential campaign. They are very fine people, but they know very little about government. The second consequence of this system is, and I think Ken and I, particularly our presence here, symbolizes it. This kind of long, protracted system, during most of which most voters are bored to tears, gives an unhealthy and unnatural significance to the role of the mass media. We do not have the capacity to screen candidates for the presidency, and we should not be exercising that power in the press to the extent which we are under this kind of a circumstance. And if you want a prime example of that, look back to the 1979 so-called caucuses in the state of Florida, where there was so little inherent significance in the process that it was only through the interpretation of the press that anybody knew who had won or lost, and that is not a role which the press should be playing if it's going to play a healthy role in this society.
This is, let me ask you both, because I think it's an issue that has to be faced up to. You make the point that the pressures are so hard and so heavy on the media, both print and electronic. To what degree do you think, therefore, the process of election can depend on an ability to manipulate the media under these pressure conditions?
I've never seen a candidate yet who really had a capacity to manipulate the media over a long period of time. The media is too diverse a group of people. They pay too much attention to presidential elections at this point over too long a period of time. I just don't think it can be done that long a time.
Mr. Broder?
I wish I shared that view, but we have written more nonsense. I have written more nonsense about candidates being cued by their own. I have been manipulated. I mean, there's no way to avoid that fact. And while I do not think that in personal terms it's been terribly harmful, I quake at the thought that some readers have been influenced by me while I was in the process of being manipulated by this kind of a game.
Mr. Scammon, would you like to comment on that point?
Yes, in this sense. I think we miss something here when we assume, in a retreat to nostalgia, that the abolition of the era of primary, as it's seen by my colleague Dave Broder, would result in some kind of a fresh, new, reformed kind of political life. I suggest to you that the primaries held in 1979 in Florida are exactly the kind of thing you would expect. And I suggest that a system of caucus and convention, rather than primary, would lead to the expenditure of money and the commitment of candidates just as great, if not greater, in the next subsequent presidential elections than the primary system does. Because they would have to get out there and maneuver the way Farley did in '32 when he was putting up Roosevelt. And you would find this constantly there without any of the saving grace of public opinion.
I wonder if we haven't skated a bit too rapidly over the role of the media. It seems to me that when Dave Broder is suggesting that he personally, our most distinguished political journalist, I think we'd all vote for that, has been manipulated and he's been wrong, and that maybe somewhere there is a kind of a super Broder who would not make any of the mistakes, would really tell it like it is. I, on the other hand, think that there's a good reason to believe that it's inherent in the very nature of the system itself, that as I look at the way, to some degree, print journalism, but much more television journalism, which, forgive me, Dave, I think is far more important in the total life of the nation than print journalism will ever be again. And I think that the one way to understand what the television journalists are doing is not that they are favor liberals, as some think, or conservatives, as others think, that they're for the Democrats, as some think, or for the Republicans, as others think, or they're for Teddy, or they're for Jimmy, or they're for Ron, or whatever. I don't think any of those things is true. I think that their maximum objective and dream would be to get everybody watching their coverage of the convention or their nightly news and nobody watching any of the other networks. They're in a highly competitive business, and the fact is, if you think about it a bit, political reporting in this country, particularly in its electronic version, is a form of sports reporting. What you're told is who's ahead and who's behind, some quaint things about the boys and the team in their off hours, and the whole thing is to be able to kind of second guess it in advance, who's likely to be ahead, who's expected to do well. Even in this example of those 1979 Florida, whatever it wasn't a caucus, it wasn't a convention, it certainly wasn't very entertaining. Whatever that was, you and your colleagues, Dave, told us at some length, look, this doesn't mean anything, it's unimportant, and now let us tell you in detail about what seems to be going on in this unimportant event. It looks like in Dade County, thus and such will happen. And we were told an awful lot about something after there'd been a couple of sentences about how it's unimportant. I think that's the reason for that was it was a horse race. It was a contest. There was going to be a winner and a loser. And if maybe it wasn't obvious from the situation who the winner and the loser was, I think the networks would have found one.
John, if I may just try to nudge the conversation in one direction, I think there is an obligation on the part of those of us who've been so critical of the changes to suggest what might be done in the practical world and not in an ideal world to restore what I would regard as some balance to this kind of a selection system. I think we're pretty much agreed among the four of us that we want a mixed system, that there is some advantage in having primaries and there's probably some advantage in having a option for states to pick candidates in other ways. I certainly feel that the due process kind of rules change reforms that were achieved after 1968 in terms of requiring local parties to publish their rules, to identify clearly their meeting places, to open their doors to all of the eligible people who want to participate. Those are all, it seems to me, fundamentals that one has a right to expect of a political party. But the mixture is the critical thing, because what I would insist on as the missing element in this system as it's operating today is that element of peer review, of intelligent, detached judgment by people who know these candidates well. And to achieve that, I think you have to do two things to the existing system. One, the parties have to use their own authority to reduce the number of primaries that are held in this country. Second, they have to find ways to build in a significant presence at the nominating convention for those who, by virtue of their own past experience in the parties and in public office, have more than average knowledge of these candidates, and not be embarrassed about the fact that they are waiting that convention to give a special role to those who can legitimately claim special knowledge in the nominating process.
David, the parties have already begun to do at least the second part of this by adding in some party leaders over and above the state allocation of delegates for 1980. I don't know how you reduce the number of primaries, how you persuade states to not hold primaries, except I think it's probably going to happen anyway of its own natural course. I think there's a lot of frivolity going on with primaries in the states now, and I think eventually there's going to be a little bit of stability returned, and I think anything the parties can do to at least make the primaries that we have responsive instruments to public will is fine, and I think we've got better primaries as a result of the reforms. Given a little time, maybe this whole impulse to abolishing the Electoral College, national primary, national initiative, and so forth, will begin to wane a little bit, and the pendulum will swing back to a kind of a mixed system. It has in the past.
Well, I would suggest we've opened up the subject very broadly, and we might well move now to the question and answer session.
Yes, I'm Ralph Regula, representative from Ohio, and I'd like to direct my question to Dave Broder. And that is, doesn't the present system tend to make the presidency a lame duck much earlier in the term than it would be under the old system, and in effect diminish the clout of the president very substantially, and thereby have a deleterious effect on the overall governing of our nation?
I think the history of the last two presidencies would indicate that. The fact that both Mr. Ford and Mr. Carter were challenged relatively early in their term by other people who, in their own party, who were prepared to go out, spend a good deal of time campaigning against those two presidents, forced them to deflect their energies and attention from their jobs at an earlier stage of the first term than would normally have been the case. I think you're absolutely right about that.
I don't think there's any real evidence for that. I think Gerald Ford is evidence for the contrary. He was an appointed president, bore a heavy burden of Watergate and a minority party, Republican Party, in the general election, never had run for an office outside Grand Rapids. He was challenged by a man who ostensibly had a solid grassroots base in his own party, challenged early, held him off, and damn near won the presidential election against Jimmy Carter, against the majority party. I don't think that, the one example we have gives you any evidence of that.
Dr. Ranney, you want to talk to me?
Well, if we're going to use evidence instead of self-evident truths that we were using before, then Ken is, of course, quite right. We only have a small number of cases, and it's very difficult to generalize. However, my view would be that the whole burden of the rules is to make it very easy to challenge an incumbent president. And I will reason it out as kind of first principles and self-evidently logically true, Ken, that henceforth no incumbent president, whatever his name may be, is ever again going to have an absolute cinch on being renominated regardless of the political conditions than used to be the case.
I think that's true. It used to be axiomatic. If he was eligible for re-election, you could not deny the renomination to a sitting president. I think that was a flaw in our system. I think it's been eliminated.
It certainly has been eliminated.
And should have been. And should have been. In other words, why should we automatically assume we elect for 8 years? That wasn't the purpose of the Constitution. It isn't the purpose of political life. The purpose is to reestablish your connection with the voter, let them assess your record in the first 4 years. And again, I hate to get back to this primitive democratic business here, John, but throw him out if they don't like him. I don't think there's any God-given right to a second term.
You have raised the issue of the Constitution. Let me phrase a question which we touched on, but perhaps didn't go to in any great depth when we spoke of what might happen in the future. Are we discussing a constitutional question or just a political question? Dr. Ranney?
Well, I think that's a very appropriate question, John. I mean, we are, after all, now in the so-called bicentennial era, where we're now looking forward to the bicentennial of the Constitution of the United States. And surely the way in which we nominate our candidates, though it's, the Founding Fathers hardly knew or thought anything about political parties, most of it disapproving, and they certainly would not have dreamed that we would go about selecting our presidents in the fashion we do. I would say that it is much a part of the Constitution as anything that you will find written, and I would add that when we make a fundamental change in our mode of selecting the president, which for better or for worse, I think we'd all agree we certainly have done in the past decade, then in my view that is as profound a change in our total Constitution as anything that you can think of adopted by formal amendment, and more profound than most of what you'll find in those 26 written amendments.
The next question, please. Sir?
My name is Charles Butterworth from the University of Maryland. It seems to me that at the beginning of the panel, Mr. Broder posed a problem. He spoke in favor of what he called expert assessment and implicitly criticized what I would term mass appreciation. That hasn't been met, as nearly as I can see. I wonder if any of the other panelists would care to speak against the idea of expert assessment, or perhaps in favor of the converse, namely mass appreciation.
It's an unanswerable argument. That's why they're silent.
No, I tell you why one is silent. The prospect of considering the intelligent, detached judgment of a Chicago ward leader leaves me with dismay. If you ask me, can he decide what's going to win his ward next trip? Fine, 100%. How much paving money goes here? You know, what goes here? Take care of that zoning ordinance and so on, yes. But intelligent, detached judgment implies that there is an Olympic quality to the county chairman, which I think even the county chairman would deny if he understood what you were talking about. If you mean that these are people who have a primary goal in life to get back in where they were, I can understand this, and they should have an input, because getting back in where you were has a part to play in the whole political process. But I wouldn't, David, I wouldn't glorify it. I mean, I wouldn't want to say that it represents the epitome of the human experience. I would only say that, among other things, if this leadership that you speak of, with its intelligent, detached judgment, has any capacity, it ought to be able to have some effect on the election. It ought to be able to convince some of the voters that they ought to support them and their candidates.
Let's look at what you do when you add in this mix of leaders, which the Democratic Party now has done. The Winograd Commission added a mix of leaders over and above all the delegations that the states will pick. There'll be some congressmen, senators, governors, and party leaders that will also be added as automatic ex officio delegates. John Sears said it best, I think, in 1976 when he was running Mr. Reagan's campaign. He said very simply, the party hierarchy is with an incumbent president. If you put these people on in the delegations automatically, what you've done, and you should face it, is you've built in an edge for an incumbent president.
Now you have heard the response, and here's what it is. One, Chicago ward leaders are not all graduates of the University of Chicago. I regret that personally, but that does not in any way lessen my judgment, my opinion, that they are better prepared than the average citizen of Chicago who has 5 minutes exposure to candidates on the television tube to make some assessment as to whether the candidates are electable, and two, if elected, will bring embarrassment or glory to the party which sustains that ward leader. The second argument is that incumbent party officials are inclined to support an incumbent president. Right, and rightly so, because they picked him, they're stuck with him, they're responsible for him, and in a proper political system, they ought to bear the responsibility for his success or failure.
Dr. Ranney?
I think the interesting thing about this is that in the case of party of the incumbent president, they didn't pick him. He picked himself. The voters in those primaries picked him. It wasn't that most of the leaders of the Democratic Party were against Mr. Carter. They simply didn't know him at all. They couldn't have identified a photograph of him. I suspect we're likely to see a fairly more substantial desertion of that incumbent president this time, and for precisely that reason. They didn't pick him last time, and they aren't going to decide this time any more than they did last time whether he gets renominated, whether he's beaten. That decision is going to be made by these wise citizens of Chicago in their 5 minutes deliberation, and not by the ward healers in Chicago.
Next question, please. There a question here on this side? Sir.
I'm John White, Chairman.
What happy
Democratic Committee. My question goes back to something, Richard, that you touched on, and I'll try to make this question brief, and hoping that I'll get a brief one-sentence answer and then maybe a little more detailed solution. But my question is this. Obviously, through the reforms, we have opened the party process, and it's easier and easier to participate. It's easier to vote now than it's ever been in the history of this country. My question then is, why are we having fewer and fewer people, percentage-wise, participate in this easy but important process? And if you can give a short answer to why you think it's continuing to decline, can you give us a solution?
Mr. Scammon?
This may be an act of wisdom. People simply decide it isn't that important. Other things are more important. The Boston School Committee The fact that you can't have anything to say about Boston schools now if you're an elector in Boston because they're run by Judge Garrity for perhaps very sound reasons. But when you take power away from people, they tend to respond. When you take personality away from people, they tend to respond. John Kennedy was the most popular vote getter, not in the sense of how many votes he got, but in the sense of the contest he had with Mr. Nixon in 1960, brought out a higher percentage of vote than any since the First World War. Maybe you need popular candidates. I don't know, but certainly it is true that it has diminished, except in the gross participation in presidential preference primaries.
I think there must be some carryover from the polls that tell us that people are disaffected with American political institutions. You ask them what they think of the president, they say not much. You ask them what they think of Congress, they say less. You ask them if they think there's any difference between the political parties, they say no. You ask them if they think candidates will deliver on their promises, they say no. Pollsters in 1976 began to find a positive statement, a forceful statement of an intent not to vote in their polls in 76. Essentially what the voters were saying is, I don't want any liability in the outcome. And I think that we reach a dangerous point in a polity when that happens. But I think we're really probably bottoming out of that. I think probably as the generation that came of age in the 1960 election, that baby boom generation, begins to be inducted into the electorate, I think we're going to see a very sharp change, not only in voting habits, but also in kind of a content of vote.
Dr. Ranney, do you want to go to this?
Yeah, obviously, John, that's a very profound question, and obviously here, I think we've heard two bits and pieces of the answer. I'm about to give another bit of the answer, but I'm sure that there are parts of it that we don't know. I think another part of the answer, though, is one aspect of a profound revolution that's taken place in American life that we've barely touched upon here, and that is what I might call the communications revolution. Political reality for most of the people in the United States is far more today what comes over the tube than it ever was before. All right, what does come over the tube about politics? I think that I am one of those, I do not believe that television is biased for or against Republicans and Democrats, for or against liberals or conservatives, but I do think that in the very nature of the medium, it's biased against politics. We've had a good deal of evidence that this is a kind of a view of many of the correspondents, and in any event, it makes more news. And certainly, as I see people talk about politicians on television, for example, one of the things that they know is that if you look past what a politician says to what I, the correspondent, know are the real reasons he's doing what he's doing, it's always for a self-seeking reason. This is the way he thinks it's going to get him reelected. It isn't because he really believes in what he's saying or he stands for principles or anything. He thinks that it'll get him reelected. And I think that if this is where you get most of your understanding of political reality, and all of our studies show that television is the main place where we get it, and if it is true that what we see about politicians is that they are self-seeking, hypocrites, frequently liars, quite often thieves, who are doing what they were doing not for the lofty motives that they announce, but because they want to get reelected, then within a process that's run by politicians, and we've now seen what kind of people they are, why should I sully my hands by dealing with a bunch of people like that? And I do think that that is part of, although obviously not all there is to the answer.
You didn't make clear us, I don't think, whether you think that's a misperception on the part of it.
I have no doubt whatever it's a misperception, Ken, and I have no doubt that even you know it's a misperception.
I might add a point here to what Austin has said. In talking about politics around the country, I'll make the statement that I think in many instances the average member of Congress votes his personal conviction on many issues that come before him. This is always greeted with raucous disbelief. That's ridiculous. Who are you coming here and telling us from Washington that they've got anything more than the most crass, most unbelievably corrupt motives? But it's not true. I think in many cases a member will simply vote what he thinks is the right way to go. That doesn't mean that the rest of it may not have some effect on some vote. Obviously, if he comes from a wheat-growing state, he's not going to rise up and vote against every wheat subsidy program that comes down the line unless he seeks to retire ahead of his time.
All right, one final question, please.
My name is Elliot Abrams, and I'm a lawyer. One of the magnificent achievements of the reform process has gone unmentioned here tonight, and that is the imposition of a quota system that really makes the ones in the Weber and Bakke cases look like a spin at the wheel of fortune. I find that very strange. If the purpose of the process was to achieve open participation on the part of Democrats, why was it felt necessary to mandate the outcome in that way?
Elliot, I'll reply to your question with another question that when I raised those same questions the Winograd Commission, I was said, what's the matter with you? Don't you favor equal and fair and decent treatment for women?
What did you say?
It was asked from the floor.
I said I thought they ought to have exactly the same chance, no more, no less, that everybody else had. No discrimination, really no discrimination, and no quotas. And that was regarded as a very sexist and ultimately a very minority position.
But there's no reason why this should be regarded as anything new. That's been the rule since 1920 in the two national committees, equal representation of men and women. I agree with what our friend has said here. Just as I would agree with what you said, Ken, about the two-term limitation on presidents. If you really believe in democracy, you really believe in letting the people vote and elect whom they want. If you don't really believe in democracy, if you don't really believe that people are going to do the right thing, as you see what the right thing ought to be, quotas, two-term limitations, everything else to twist the natural, what in your case, not in your personal case, but in the case that many would be regarded as the essential misjudgment of the mass. And to it, John, want to only add that phrase of Sandberg's, the people, yes, and if you really believe in the people, you don't believe in these artificial restraints upon their decision-making.
You were going to talk to this
the fact is that the original McGovern Commission's response to this question was affirmative action, not quotas, not predetermined outcomes. We've gotten to the point now with respect to at least men and women where we do have a 50-50 quota operation in effect. I think the party has ever since been trying to figure out exactly what it should be doing, but I don't think that anybody ever thought that this was a permanent arrangement, and that's what it's turned out to be insofar as men and women are concerned, a permanent arrangement.
Just one final observation. It's late in the game to be mentioning it, but there is a second party in this country called the Republicans, which
what was
somehow,
that name again, Dave?
being shy and backward creatures as they are, has somehow gotten through this past decade without consuming a great portion of their energies in the process of internal reforms. And I think one of the things that we may find tested over time is whether a reformed party can compete effectively with an unreformed party.
And on that note, this concludes another public policy forum presented by the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. On behalf of AEI, our hearty thanks to the distinguished and expert panelists, Mr. Richard Scammon, Mr. David S. Broder, Mr. Ken Bode, and Dr. Austin Ranney, and to our guests and our experts in the audience for their participation.
This public policy forum on the new way we choose presidential candidates has been presented by AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. It has brought us the views of 4 experts in the field. It is the aim of AEI to illuminate important issues of the day by presenting many viewpoints, in the hope that by so doing, those who wish to learn about the decision-making process will benefit from such a free exchange of informed and enlightened opinion.
This Public Policy Forum series is created and supplied to this station as a public service by the American Enterprise Institute, Washington, D.C. For a transcript of this program, send $3.75 to the American Enterprise Institute, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036.